I never thought planting tomatoes in my own backyard would lead to being assaulted, police involvement, and exposing a neighborhood tyrant's years-long scheme. But that's exactly what happened when Stephanie Wilson decided that property lines, legal boundaries, and basic human decency didn't apply to her mission of HOA domination. The confrontation that would eventually escalate into a neighborhood war began on a perfect Saturday morning in April. After 5 years of apartment living, I had finally purchased my dream home, a charming craftsman with a generous yard backing up to the Preston Oaks subdivision. The real estate agent had been explicitly clear. Your property ends at that tree line. You're not part of the HOA, which saves you their $350 monthly fees, but you get the benefit of being adjacent to their well-maintained community. Freedom from HOA restrictions was actually a selling point for me. I wanted to grow vegetables, install a fire pit, and maybe build a workshop eventually, all things typically regulated or outright forbidden by homeowners associations. I was on my knees in the freshly tilled garden bed, hands deep in soil as I planted my first tomato seedlings, when a shadow fell across my work. Excuse me, but vegetable gardens are not permitted in front-facing yards. I looked up, squinting against the morning sun, to see a woman standing at the edge of my garden. Everything about her radiated authority, from her perfectly highlighted bob to her crisp white capris and polo shirt embroidered with Preston Oaks HOA. "This is my backyard," I replied, confused by both her statement and her presence on my property. She gave a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. According to Preston Oaks guidelines, this is considered a side yard with street visibility. Section 8.3 clearly prohibits vegetable gardens in any yard visible from community areas. I stood, brushing soil from my hands. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm not part of Preston Oaks. My property isn't in your HOA." The woman's expression shifted from officious to incredulous. "That's incorrect. All properties bordering the community green space fall under our jurisdiction. Not according to my property deed and the county records," I explained, maintaining a friendly tone despite my growing irritation. "My property line extends to those trees, but I'm not actually part of Preston Oaks." As if I hadn't spoken, she removed a phone from her pocket and began photographing my garden beds. "I'll need you to remove these plantings by Wednesday. The fine for unapproved landscaping is $200, but we typically waive it for first-time violations if corrected promptly." "Ma'am," I said more firmly, "I don't mean to be rude, but you're trespassing on private property that is not under your HOA's jurisdiction. I'd appreciate it if you'd stop photographing my yard and leave." She lowered her phone, her expression hardening. "I'm Stephanie Wilson, Preston Oaks HOA president. I've held this position for 9 years, and I can assure you that your property falls within our enforcement boundaries." "The property deed says otherwise," I replied. "I specifically confirmed this before purchasing." Stephanie's lips pressed into a bloodless line. "Deeds can have errors. Our community master plan clearly shows this parcel as part of Preston Oaks." The conversation was becoming surreal. I tried a different approach. "I'm Alex Bennett, by the way. I just moved in last month. Perhaps we could discuss this after I've had a chance to review the documents you're referring to." "There's nothing to discuss," she replied, returning to her photography. "The violations are clear. Unapproved vegetable garden, non-standard border, materials and," she glanced at my stack of garden supplies, "what appears to be preparation for unapproved structures." My patience evaporated. "Ms. Wilson, I've tried to be polite, but I'm now explicitly asking you to leave my property. This is not part of Preston Oaks. I am not subject to your HOA rules, and you are trespassing." She straightened, meeting my gaze with cold determination. "I don't think you understand how things work here. Preston Oaks maintains certain community standards, and we don't allow exceptions, especially for border properties that affect our aesthetic continuity." "What I understand," I replied, "is property law. This parcel is not in your HOA, period. Now please leave before I'm forced to call the police to report a trespasser." For a moment something dangerous flashed in her eyes, a glimpse of the fury beneath her controlled facade. Then her expression smoothed into something more calculating. "I see we're going to have difficulties." She tucked her phone away deliberately. You should know that those who oppose Preston Oaks standards typically find home ownership here challenging. I'm not in Preston Oaks, I repeated, enunciating each word. That's the point. She turned to leave, but paused at the edge of my yard. You'll be receiving formal notice of violations by Monday. I suggest you familiarize yourself with our community guidelines before making any more unauthorized changes. As she marched away, I noticed a neighbor watching from his driveway across the street. He gave me a small sympathetic nod before quickly turning back to his yard work. That evening, as I researched my property boundaries to reassure myself I wasn't losing my mind, my doorbell rang. It was the neighbor from across the street, looking nervously over his shoulder before speaking. "I'm Jim Carson. Saw you met Stephanie today." He spoke quickly, keeping his voice low. "Just wanted to warn you. She does this to everyone on the border of Preston Oaks. Claims the HOA boundaries extend beyond what's in the legal documents." "But that's not true, right?" I asked, suddenly questioning everything. "Not legally, no. But she's made life hell for everyone who challenges her. Just..." He glanced around again. "Get security cameras. Trust me on this." As he hurried away, I noticed a silver SUV driving slowly past my house. Stephanie Wilson was behind the wheel, openly watching my home like it was under surveillance. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding or an overzealous HOA president. This was my first encounter with someone who believed rules, including property laws and personal boundaries, simply didn't apply to her, and it was only the beginning. Monday morning delivered exactly what Stephanie had promised: a crisp white envelope containing an official-looking notice of violations on Preston Oaks HOA letterhead. The document listed my unapproved vegetable garden, along with 3 additional violations I hadn't even been aware of: non-conforming exterior paint accent, unauthorized landscape borders, and improper placement of trash receptacles. The bottom of the notice specified a $450 fine, due within 15 days, with an additional $50 daily penalty for uncorrected violations. I nearly spilled my coffee. $450. For violations of rules that didn't apply to my property. After the encounter with Stephanie, I had spent Sunday researching my property status. My closing documents clearly specified non-HOA parcel and the county. Assessor's website confirmed my lot was outside Preston Oaks' legal boundaries. I had even called my title company, who reaffirmed what I already knew. My property was definitively not part of any homeowners association. I pinned the violation notice to my refrigerator and headed to work, determined to address this properly rather than reactively. That evening, I drove directly to the county recorder's office to obtain official copies of my property plat, deed, and the Preston Oaks HOA incorporation documents showing the legally defined boundaries. The clerk helped me locate what I needed. "Looks like you're right on the line," she observed, comparing the documents. "Your property is Lot 37 of the original Meadowbrook development. Preston Oaks begins with Lot 38, on the other side of that green space." "So there's no question about jurisdiction?" I asked. "None whatsoever," she confirmed, stamping official copies for me. "Your property is not subject to their covenants or regulations." Armed with these documents, I drafted a formal letter to the Preston Oaks HOA. I kept the tone professional but firm, included copies of the relevant property records, and explicitly stated that 1. My property was not under their jurisdiction. 2. I would not be paying any fines. And 3. HOA representatives should not enter my property without permission. The next day, I hand-delivered the letter to the Preston Oaks Community Center, obtaining a receipt from the administrative assistant. I also made a point of introducing myself courteously, emphasizing that while I respected their community standards, my property was simply outside their legal boundaries. I hoped that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days later, I arrived, home from work to find not 1 but 3 people standing in my front yard, clipboard in hand, examining my house. I recognized Stephanie immediately, along with 2 men in Preston Oaks polo shirts. "Excuse me," I called as I exited my car. "Can I help you with something?" Stephanie turned, her expression suggesting I was interrupting something important, rather. then confronting trespassers on my own property. Mr. Bennett, the Architectural Committee is conducting its assessment of your violations. I sent documentation proving my property isn't under your jurisdiction, I replied, approaching the group. Did you receive my letter? We received your correspondence, she acknowledged with dismissive wave. However, our community maps clearly show this parcel as subject to architectural oversight. These gentlemen are here to determine the extent of necessary corrections. The taller man extended his hand. Richard Knowles, Architectural Committee Chair, we're just doing a standard evaluation of a property that isn't in your HOA, I interrupted, my patience thinning. I have county-certified documents showing Preston Oak's boundaries end at the green space behind my lot. That's a common misunderstanding, Stephanie interjected smoothly. The original development plans included this parcel in our enforcement zone, even if certain tax designations suggest otherwise. Something in her phrasing caught my attention. This wasn't simple confusion. It was deliberate. Misrepresentation. Please leave my property, I stated firmly. You're trespassing, and I have documentation proving you have no authority here. Richard looked uncomfortable, glancing at Stephanie. Perhaps we should verify the boundary documentation before proceeding. The boundaries are clear, Stephanie snapped, her composed facade cracking slightly. We don't need permission to enforce community standards. Actually, you do, I countered. That's exactly how property law works. And since this isn't your property or under your jurisdiction, I'm formally asking all of you to leave immediately. The second man, who hadn't spoken yet, tugged at Richard's sleeve. Maybe we should go, Rick. If his deed says he's not in the... Cheers? Stephanie's glare could have melted steel. Fine, but this isn't resolved, Mr. Bennett. The board will be reviewing your situation at our next meeting. As they retreated down my driveway, I heard Stephanie already spinning the narrative. He's clearly being uncooperative, which is why we need to consider the special assessment for border enforcement. The encounter left me unsettled enough to follow Jim Carson's advice. That weekend, I installed security cameras covering my property perimeter, front yard and backyard. The system included motion detection alerts to my phone, a feature that would prove invaluable sooner than I expected. Monday brought a second violation notice, this one marked "Final Warning" in aggressive red lettering. The fine had mysteriously increased to $750, with threats of legal action and property liens. I filed it with my growing collection of documentation. Later that week, Jim caught me as I was mowing my lawn. Stephanie's been talking about you at HOA meetings, he warned. Telling everyone you're trying to exploit a loophole to avoid community standards while benefiting from proximity to Preston Oaks. That's ridiculous, I replied. I specifically bought this house because it wasn't in an HOA. Jim shrugged. Doesn't matter to Stephanie. She believes any house she can see belongs under her authority. She's done this before. Wears people down until they either comply or move. Has anyone successfully stood up to her? His expression darkened. The Ramirez tried last year. Their property is on the other side of Preston Oaks, also outside. The boundaries. Stephanie made their lives hell for months. They eventually sold and moved rather than keep fighting. That evening, while reviewing my security camera settings, I noticed movement on my side yard feed. The footage showed Stephanie, alone this time, measuring my fence height with a tape measure while taking photos on her phone. She moved methodically around my property, documenting every aspect as if conducting an official inspection. The brazen trespassing infuriated me. This wasn't just an overzealous HOA president confused about boundaries. This was deliberate harassment. I called the non-emergency police line to report the trespassing, providing the video evidence. The responding officer viewed the footage, but seemed reluctant to take action. This looks like a civil dispute over HOA jurisdiction, he suggested. Have you tried resolving this through mediation? It's not a dispute, I insisted. My property is definitively outside their HOA. I have the county records proving it. She's trespassing on private property to harass me. The officer made notes, but offered little hope. Without evidence of threats or property damage, this falls into a civil matter. I'd recommend sending a certified letter explicitly prohibiting her from entering your property. Frustrated but determined, I followed his advice. The next day, I sent Stephanie a certified letter specifically forbidding her or any Preston Oaks representatives from entering my property without written permission, citing the video evidence of her trespassing. The response came not from Stephanie, but from Preston Oaks Legal Department. A letterhead I would later discover was fabricated. The message was clear. Preston Oaks HOA maintains enforcement rights on all properties within the community visual corridor, regardless of technical boundary designations. As I researched property attorneys that evening, my phone buzzed with a security alert. The live feed showed Stephanie at my back fence, clipboard in hand, once again documenting violations from my yard. The boundary dispute had clearly moved beyond simple misunderstanding. This was a calculated campaign of harassment and intimidation, one that would soon escalate beyond anything I could have anticipated. By the third week of Stephanie's harassment campaign, a clear pattern had emerged. Each day brought new violation notices, each more ridiculous than the last. My doorbell camera captured her daily inspections, always when I was likely at work, always with the same methodical documentation of my supposed infractions. "It's like living under surveillance in my own home," I told Jim as we chatted across our driveways one evening. "That's exactly her strategy," he confirmed grimly. "Psychological warfare. Make you feel watched until you either comply or leave." My security system had become both my greatest ally and a source of constant stress, buzzing with alerts throughout the day. 17 M. Stephanie photographing my mailbox, apparently 2.3 inches taller than regulation height. 11:42 a.m. Stephanie measuring the distance between my garden pavers, 2:35 p.m. Stephanie documenting the wind chimes on my porch as unauthorized auditory disturbances. The cameras caught her entering my backyard on multiple occasions, once even more, peering through my windows when she thought I wasn't home. Each trespass was methodically added to my growing evidence file. I filed 2 more police reports, but the officers maintained it was a civil matter requiring a formal cease and desist through an attorney. One sympathetic officer suggested I post no trespassing signs, which I promptly installed around my property perimeter. Stephanie's response was immediate and bizarre. She began conducting her surveillance from just outside my property line, standing on the public sidewalk or the community green space with binoculars and a camera with a telephoto lens. Technically legal, utterly unhinged. Doesn't she have a job? I wondered aloud during a call with my sister. Who has time for this level of harassment? The answer came from Rebecca, another neighbor who approached me cautiously while I was checking my mail. "Stephanie actually gets paid to do this," she explained, keeping her voice low. "She owns Valley View Property Management, which has an exclusive contract with Preston Oaks. She receives a percentage of all violation fines collected." This revelation transformed my understanding of the harassment. This wasn't just about control, it was financial. Each violation notice represented potential profit. "Her company also gets commissions on property sales within Preston Oaks," Rebecca continued. "There's a rumor she deliberately targets certain homeowners to pressure them into selling, then collects fees on the transactions. The financial motive explained Stephanie's determination to claim my property fell under her jurisdiction. It literally expanded her territory for generating revenue. My security cameras soon revealed I wasn't her only target. Footage occasionally captured her conducting similar inspections of other boundary properties, clipboard in hand, photographing supposed violations. She had created her own little surveillance state, with herself as both enforcer and financial beneficiary. The most disturbing escalation came when I discovered she was collecting information about me personally. My doorbell camera caught her questioning a delivery driver about my packages. Another time, she stopped my mail carrier, apparently asking about my correspondence. "She's done this before," Jim warned me. "Builds dossiers on problem residents to use against them. She had the water shut off at the Martinez place after reporting them for a bogus code violation. Taking his warning seriously, I installed additional cameras covering all approaches to my home. I set up a P.O. box for important mail. I began varying my routine, sometimes leaving for work early or late to avoid predictable patterns. Living under such surveillance was exhausting. Even inside my own home, I found myself checking windows, keeping blinds closed, speaking more quietly. The psychological toll of being constantly watched was exactly what Stephanie counted on to break her targets. When direct surveillance and violation notices failed to produce compliance, Stephanie escalated to the next phase of her campaign: community pressure. "She's telling everyone you're operating an illegal business from home," Rebecca reported after a Preston Oaks community meeting. "Claims you're violating zoning regulations and threatening property values." The rumors spread quickly. Neighbors from Preston Oaks, who had previously waved or chatted, now avoided eye contact. Anonymous complaints about my property began appearing on the community Facebook page, all using the same phrasing Stephanie favored in her violation notices. I decided it was time to consult an attorney. Maria Gonzalez, a property rights specialist, reviewed my evidence with professional interest that turned to outrage as she watched the security footage. "This is textbook harassment," she concluded. "And if she's profiting from fraudulent violation notices, that potentially constitutes fraud. The trespassing alone gives us grounds for a restraining order." She helped me draft a formal cease and desist letter, specifically addressing Stephanie's false claims of jurisdiction and documenting each trespass with timestamps from security footage. The letter demanded she stop all harassment, surveillance, and false claims regarding my property or face legal action. The letter was delivered by courier the following day. Stephanie's response came within hours, not in writing, but in person. My security alert chimed as I was preparing dinner. The video showed Stephanie marching up my driveway, accompanied by a man in a suit carrying a briefcase. "Mr. Bennett," she called, pounding on my front door. "We need to discuss your threatening correspondence immediately." I opened the door but remained behind the threshold, security chain engaged. "Any communication should go through my attorney." "This is Mr. Patterson, legal counsel for Preston Oaks," she announced, gesturing to her companion. "Your cease and desist letter contains defamatory claims that could expose you to significant liability." The man looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight as if he'd rather be anywhere else. "Perhaps we could discuss this matter privately." "There's nothing to discuss," I replied firmly. "My property is not under HOA jurisdiction. Ms. Wilson is trespassing repeatedly, and all of it is documented. Unless you're here to agree to leave." "Me alone, we have nothing to talk about." Stephanie's face flushed with anger. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "By the time I'm finished, are you threatening me?" I interrupted, making sure my security camera captured the exchange. "Because that would be extremely unwise given the current circumstances." Her companion tugged at her arm. "Stephanie, we should go," she shook him off. "This isn't over, Bennett, not by a long shot." As they retreated down my driveway, I heard the attorney hissing urgently, "You never said he had security cameras everywhere. This changes the situation completely." That evening, reviewing the footage of their visit, I realized Stephanie's surveillance campaign had backfired spectacularly. Her obsession with watching me had blinded her to the fact that she was being watched too. Her every trespass, false claim, and intimidation attempt meticulously documented for legal proceedings. The surveillance campaign was about to enter a new phase, one where her own tactics would be used as evidence against her. My sister Megan's visit was supposed to be a welcome break from the ongoing Stephanie situation. She'd planned the trip months ago, long before I had any idea my new home came with its own neighborhood tyrant. I spent Friday evening preparing for her arrival, cleaning the house, stocking the refrigerator, and setting up the guest room. You sure you want to come?" I'd asked during our last phone call. "Things are pretty tense with the neighbor situation." "All the more reason I should visit," she'd insisted. "You need backup, and I want to see this HOA nightmare in person." Saturday morning dawned clear and beautiful. Perfect weather for the small backyard barbecue I'd planned to introduce Megan to my few friendly neighbors. Jim and Rebecca had agreed to come, along with 2 other neighbors from my side of the boundary line who had their own Stephanie stories to share. Megan arrived around noon, her husband Todd and their 10-year-old twins, Emma and Noah, piling out of their SUV with weekend bags and excited chatter. "Uncle Alex!" the twins chorused, rushing to hug me. Nice place, Todd observed, surveying the house. Which neighbor? Is the crazy one? I gestured vaguely toward Preston Oaks. She's been quiet the last couple days. Maybe the legal letter finally got through to her. I should have known better. Stephanie Wilson didn't retreat. She escalated. The first sign of trouble came as we were setting up for the barbecue. My security app chimed with an alert, showing Stephanie parked across the street, photographing. Megan's SUV in my driveway, is that her? Megan asked, peering over my shoulder at the phone. In all her clipboard-wielding glory, I confirmed. She's just sitting there taking pictures of us? That's seriously creepy. We decided to ignore her, and proceeded with our plans. Todd helped me set up the grill while Megan arranged the patio furniture. The twins immediately claimed the yard, tossing a frisbee back and forth with the boundless energy of children, finally free after a long car ride. Jim and Rebecca arrived around 3, bearing side dishes and knowing looks as they spotted Stephanie, still conducting surveillance from her vehicle. She's documenting your unauthorized gathering, Jim explained, making air quotes. There's probably some obscure Preston Oaks rule about guest limits. But I'm not in Preston Oaks, I reminded. Him the familiar refrain becoming almost comical in its repetition. Details, Rebecca quipped, setting down her potato salad. Don't confuse the Queen with facts about her kingdom. The afternoon progressed pleasantly, despite Stephanie's distant presence. The kids played yard games, the adults enjoyed good food and conversation, and for a few hours I almost forgot about the property dispute entirely. That peaceful interlude shattered at precisely 4:17 p.m., according to my security log. As we were clearing plates from the patio table, Stephanie appeared at my side gate, clipboard in hand, and 2 HOA board members trailing reluctantly behind her. Mr. Bennett, she announced loudly, as if addressing a public gathering, this gathering exceeds the permitted number of guests without prior authorization. Additionally, the recreational activities, she gestured toward the twins now playing badminton, exceed acceptable noise levels for residential areas. The conversation on the patio died instantly. Megan froze mid-sentence, staring in disbelief. Stephanie, I replied with forced calm, you know you're not welcome on my property. Please leave immediately. She ignored me completely, pushing the gate open and stepping into my backyard as if she owned it. The violation total is now approaching $2,000, and the board is considering additional enforcement measures. Todd moved protectively toward the children, while Megan stepped forward, incredulity giving way to anger. Excuse me, who do you think? You are. This is private property. I'm the Preston Oaks HOA president, Stephanie replied dismissively, not even looking at Megan as she continued photographing the yard. Recreational equipment must be approved before installation, she pointed, her clipboard toward the badminton net. That's when I noticed her companion's discomfort. One was openly backing away toward the gate, clearly wanting no part of this confrontation. The other whispered urgently, Stephanie, we're technically off HOA property here. All properties in the visual corridor are subject to standards enforcement. She snapped, advancing further into my yard. I stepped directly into her path, blocking her progress toward the patio. Stephanie, this is your final warning. Leave my property now or I'm calling the police to remove you. Her eyes narrowed, face flushing with anger. You don't give me warnings, Mr. Bennett. I'm conducting official HOA business. Not on my property. You're not, I stated firmly. This is trespassing and you know it. For a moment something dangerous flashed across her face, a glimpse of the rage simmering beneath her officious exterior. Then, without warning, she attempted to step around me, pushing past toward my patio where my family watched in stunned silence. I shifted to block her path again, careful not to make physical contact, but firmly preventing her from advancing further into my property. Move aside, she demanded, voice rising. This obstruction will be added to your violations. Stephanie, I'm not touching you, but you need to leave my property right now. What happened next occurred so quickly that if not for the security cameras, I might have questioned my own recollection. As I stood my ground, Stephanie's composure shattered completely. She swung her clipboard down, then brought her open palm up and across, connecting sharply with the side of my face. The slap wasn't particularly painful, but the shock of it froze everyone in place. A stunned silence fell over the yard. Broken. only by the sound of one of Stephanie's companions gasping, "Oh my God!" I carefully stepped back, hands raised to show I wasn't retaliating. "Everyone saw that, Stephanie. You just assaulted me on my own property after trespassing." For a fraction of a second, I glimpsed panic in her eyes, the realization that she had crossed a line from which there was no easy retreat. Then, with stunning speed, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "Emergency services? I need police. Immediately," she said, voice suddenly trembling. "I've been assaulted by a homeowner while performing my HOA duties. I fear for my safety." The audacity was breathtaking. Even her companions seemed stunned by the blatant reversal of events. One immediately backed away, hands raised as if disassociating himself from her claims. "I didn't see that happen," he stated loudly enough for everyone to hear. "She slapped him, not the other way around." Megan had already pulled out her phone, replaying the security camera footage that had captured the entire incident. The kids huddled together on the patio, confused and frightened by the sudden tension. "You're making a false police report," I told Stephanie calmly. "The entire incident is on video from multiple angles." She covered the phone receiver for a moment. "Nobody will believe your doctored footage. I have 2 board members as witnesses." Both men were already shaking their heads, one actively walking away down the driveway, wanting no part of her false narrative. As we waited for police to arrive, a bizarre standoff ensued. Stephanie refused to leave my property, claiming she was waiting for police protection. My family and guests gathered on the patio, reviewing the security footage that clearly showed her trespassing and assault. The remaining board member stood awkwardly by the gate, visibly distancing himself from Stephanie's version of events. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension. Police cars pulled up in front of my house, responding to what they'd been told was, "An assault in progress. Officers will sort this out," Stephanie declared with renewed confidence. "Her assault is a criminal matter, not civil." As the police approached my backyard, I felt a strange sense of calm. For weeks, I'd been told my HOA dispute was merely a civil matter unworthy of police intervention. Now, thanks to Stephanie's own actions, it had finally become the criminal matter it had always been, just not in the way she intended. The breaking point had arrived, but it wasn't mine. Stephanie had finally broken under the pressure of her own making, crossing the line from harassment to physical assault. And unlike the boundaries of Preston Oaks that she so freely manipulated, this was one line she couldn't redraw to suit her purposes. As the officers entered my backyard, Megan held up her phone with the security footage ready to play. "Officers, you need to see this first," she said, "before anyone makes any statements." The moment of truth had arrived. 2 officers entered my backyard, expressions carefully neutral as they assessed the tense scene. I recognized the older one. Officer Reynolds had responded to one of my previous trespassing complaints against Stephanie. "We received a 911 call about an assault," he stated, looking between Stephanie and me. "What's going on here?" Before I could speak, Stephanie stepped forward, hand dramatically touching her cheek. "I was conducting a routine HOA inspection when this man became aggressive and struck me," she declared, voice quavering with practiced distress. I feared for my safety. Officer Reynolds turned to me, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Mr. Bennett, correct? From the HOA boundary dispute calls." I nodded. "Officer, this woman is trespassing on my property after multiple warnings. She attempted to push past me to access my backyard, and when I blocked her path, without touching her, she slapped me across the face." "That's completely false," Stephanie interjected. "I was simply performing my duties as HOA president when he became confrontational and attacked me." The younger officer began separating people, creating space between Stephanie and my family. "Let's get statements from everyone individually," he suggested, clearly following protocol for domestic disturbances. "Before we do that," Megan said firmly, holding up her phone, "you need to see this. The entire incident is on video." Officer Reynolds looked to his partner, who nodded. They both watched the security footage, which clearly showed Stephanie entering my yard uninvited, attempting to push past me, and then delivering the open-handed slap when I blocked her progress. "There's another angle from the side camera," I explained, pulling up the feed on my own phone. This view was even more damning, clearly showing Stephanie as the aggressor while I kept my hands visible and made no threatening movements. The officers exchanged glances. "Miss Wilson," Officer Reynolds said, his tone shifting, "this video seems to contradict your statement about being attacked." Stephanie's composure faltered for just a second before her indignation reasserted itself. "That footage is obviously edited. I have witnesses." She turned to the remaining HOA board member, who had been slowly backing away throughout the exchange. "I actually saw her slap him," he stated uncomfortably, "not the other way around." "Robert!" Stephanie hissed, her mask of victimhood slipping further. Officer Reynolds addressed Stephanie directly. "Ma'am, are you aware that making a false report to police is a crime in itself?" "I'm not making a false report," she insisted, though her voice had lost its conviction. "I want him charged with assault and interference with HOA duties." "Ms. Wilson," the younger officer interjected, "our department has multiple records of Mr. Bennett informing you that this property is not under HOA jurisdiction. Do you have documentation proving otherwise?" "The visual corridor clause in our—" "That's not a legal designation," I interrupted. "My property deed, county records, and the HOA's own incorporation documents all confirm my property is outside Preston Oaks boundaries." Officer Reynolds had been taking notes. "Ms. Wilson, were you invited onto this property today? HOA officials don't need—" "It's a simple question," he pressed. "Did Mr. Bennett invite you onto his property?" "No, but—" "And were you previously warned not to enter his property without permission?" Stephanie's face flushed. "He can't restrict HOA inspections." "He can if—" "His property isn't in your HOA," the officer stated flatly. "Based on the evidence before us and our department's previous interactions regarding this dispute, it appears you entered private property without permission after being explicitly told not to, then physically assaulted the homeowner." The reality of her situation finally seemed to dawn on Stephanie. Her gaze darted around the yard, noting the multiple witnesses, the security cameras, and the increasingly unsympathetic expressions of the police officers. "I want to press charges," I stated calmly, "for trespassing, assault, and filing a false police report." "You can't be serious," Stephanie sputtered. "This is clearly a misunderstanding about property boundaries. The boundary issue is civil," Officer Reynolds acknowledged. "The trespassing after explicit warnings, physical assault, and false police report are criminal matters." The younger officer moved toward Stephanie. "Ma'am, please turn around and place your hands behind your back." "You're arresting me?" Her voice rose to a pitch that made everyone wince. "Do you know who I am? My brother-in-law works for the county commissioner's office." "Ma'am, please don't make this more difficult," the officer warned. What followed was both vindicating and uncomfortable to witness. Stephanie refused to comply, requiring the officers to physically turn her around to apply handcuffs. Throughout the process, she alternated between threats and pleas, naming various officials she claimed would make them regret this. As the officers escorted her toward their patrol car, she turned to deliver one final threat. "This isn't over, Bennett. The HOA board will pursue all available remedies for your violations." The remaining board member, Robert, looked mortified. "I want to be clear that I'm not supporting any of this," he told the officers. "I was brought here under false pretenses about an urgent violation." After Stephanie was secured in the police car, Officer Reynolds returned to take formal statements from everyone present. The process was methodical and thorough, with particular attention paid to the security footage that had captured the entire incident. "We'll need copies of all video evidence," he explained, "and I'd recommend filing for a restraining order first thing Monday morning. This situation has clearly escalated beyond neighborhood disputes." Once the statements were complete and the officers had collected the security footage, they provided me with information about victim services and the case number for future reference. "What happens now?" Megan asked, as the officers prepared to leave. "Ms. Wilson will be processed for assault, trespassing, and filing a false police report," Officer Reynolds explained. "Given her lack of prior criminal record, she'll likely be released on her own recognizance pending a court appearance. That's why the restraining order is important. It provides additional legal protection." As the police car pulled away with Stephanie in the back seat, a strange mix of emotions washed over me. relief that her harassment had finally resulted in consequences, concern about potential escalation, and lingering disbelief that a property boundary dispute had culminated in an arrest. My backyard gathering had been thoroughly disrupted, the celebratory mood replaced by stunned processing of what we'd just witnessed. The twins huddled with Todd on the patio, wide-eyed and confused by the adult drama. "I'm so sorry," I told everyone. "This isn't exactly what I had in mind for a relaxing family visit." Jim shook his head in amazement. "No one's going to believe this at the next neighborhood barbecue." "Actually," Rebecca added with grim satisfaction, "I think a lot of people have been waiting for Stephanie to finally go too far. This is just the first time she's done it with cameras rolling and witnesses present." As our small group dispersed, processing the day's events, Robert lingered behind. "The board isn't unified behind Stephanie," he confided quietly. "This might be the opening, needed for some significant changes in HOA leadership." The irony wasn't lost on me. After weeks of insisting my property dispute was just a civil matter, Stephanie herself had transformed it into exactly the criminal case that finally brought intervention. As the saying goes, she had finally reaped what she had sown. But something told me the harvest was far from over. Chapter 6. The community division news of Stephanie's arrest spread through the neighborhood with astonishing speed. By Sunday morning, my phone was buzzing constantly with texts from neighbors I barely knew, each message a variation of either "I can't believe she finally went too far," or "How dare you have her arrested over a misunderstanding." The community had split into factions almost overnight. The previously invisible boundary between HOA and non-HOA properties evolving into something more ideological than geographical. "It's like watching a civil war unfold," Megan observed as we had coffee on my porch, watching neighbors deliberately cross the street to avoid passing my house, while others made a point of waving supportively. "I never wanted this kind of drama," I sighed. "I just wanted to grow tomatoes and mind my own business." Stephanie had been released on her own recognizance Saturday evening, exactly as Officer Reynolds had predicted. By Sunday morning, she had already launched her counteroffensive. An emergency community meeting email went out to all Preston Oaks residents, and somehow my email had been added to the list, describing the incident in terms that bore no resemblance to reality. "HOA president attacked while protecting community standards" was the alarming subject line. The body of the message portrayed Stephanie as a dedicated public servant who had been physically threatened and attacked while addressing declining standards along community boundaries. It ended with a call for Preston Oaks residents to stand united against those attempting to undermine property values and community safety. "She's actually trying to spin being arrested for assault as some kind of martyrdom," I marveled, showing Megan the email. "Classic Darvo," she replied. "Deny attack, reverse victim and offender. I see it in workplace harassment cases all the time." The effects of Stephanie's narrative campaign became evident as the day progressed. Cars drove slowly past my house, passengers openly staring. A group of older residents gathered at the edge of the green space behind my property, pointing and discussing something while referencing clipboards similar to Stephanie's. Jim texted, "Me around noon. Stephanie's followers are going door to door with a petition to protect HOA enforcement rights, claiming you're part of a coordinated effort to undermine Preston Oaks governance." By Monday morning, the division had become physically manifest. As I left for work, I discovered printed flyers on several neighborhood light poles. "Community alert, violent anti-HOA activist in our midst," with my address prominently displayed. The flyers included a grainy image of me clearly captured, using a telephoto lens from off my property. I carefully removed and preserved one as evidence, then documented the others before removing them. The escalation was concerning, moving from harassment to potentially dangerous defamation that labeled me as violent to strangers. My attorney, Maria, was equally troubled when I sent her photos of the flyers. "This crosses several legal lines," she noted during our call. "It's defamatory, potentially constitutes incitement, and violates anti-doxing laws in this jurisdiction." She helped me file for an emergency restraining order that morning, using the police report, security footage, and new evidence of the defamatory Flyers to build a compelling case for immediate court intervention. The community division intensified throughout the week. Rebecca reported that Preston Oaks had essentially split into Team Stephanie and Team Sanity, with neighbors who had previously been friendly now avoiding each other at the community pool and park. The reasonable residents are mostly keeping their heads down, she explained. They don't support Stephanie's tactics, but are afraid of becoming her next target if they speak out. This fear proved well-founded. Neighbors who had provided statements to police about Stephanie's previous harassment found themselves suddenly receiving violation notices for infractions that had been ignored for years. Jim discovered his garbage cans had been vandalized after he publicly criticized Stephanie's leadership at a community gathering. The most disturbing development came Wednesday evening. I returned home to find a county vehicle parked in front of my house. A code enforcement officer, responding to multiple complaints about alleged violations ranging from improper waste disposal to unauthorized structures. We received 15 separate complaints about this property in the past 2 days, the officer explained, looking somewhat embarrassed by the situation. I'm required to investigate, but I can already tell there's nothing here that violates county ordinances. As he prepared to leave, he hesitated. Just between us, we've been getting flooded with similar complaints about properties along this boundary. All from the same group of callers, all using identical language in their reports. Seems like someone is abusing the system. The weaponization of county services was a significant escalation. Rather than simply harassing me with HOA notices I could ignore, Stephanie and her allies were now attempting to leverage actual governmental authority to continue their campaign. Thursday brought the discovery that someone had created a Facebook page titled Preston Oaks Property Value Protection, featuring posts about the growing threat of boundary encroachment and declining standards in the neighborhood. My house was featured prominently, with telephoto shots of my garden, and claims that it contained code violations and safety hazards. The page had nearly 200 members, a substantial portion of the Preston Oaks community. Comments ranged from reasonable questions about actual boundary lines to alarming suggestions about how to handle problem residents who threaten our way of life. I documented everything, adding each new development to the growing file for my restraining order hearing. Maria advised me to avoid direct engagement with either Stephanie's supporters or detractors, focusing instead on building our legal case. Let them dig their own hole deeper, she counseled. Every post, flyer, and false report strengthens our position. Her advice made legal sense, but didn't address the psychological toll of living in an increasingly hostile environment. Simple activities like checking my mail or watering my garden now carried the weight of being watched, judged, and potentially documented by neighbors with explicitly negative intentions. The community division reached its most public expression Friday evening. Returning from work, I found 2 groups of neighbors gathered on opposite sides of the street in front of my house. One group holding handmade signs with messages like "Stop HOA Overreach" and "Boundaries Matter," the other displaying "Protect Preston Oaks Standards and Property Values over Politics." Officer Reynolds was already on scene, keeping the group separated while repeatedly explaining that they couldn't block the sidewalk or street. "What's happening?" I asked as I approached my driveway, incredulous at the scene unfolding. "Apparently word got out about Stephanie calling an HOA vote to fund legal action against you," Jim explained, breaking away from the supportive group. "Some of us decided to show solidarity. Then her supporters showed up to counter-protest the absurdity of the situation. Essentially a property rights protest on my front lawn might have been comical if it hadn't been so concerning. What had begun as one woman's campaign of harassment had metastasized into a neighborhood-wide conflict about governance, property rights, and community standards. As I entered my home under the watchful eyes of both factions, I realized something important. This wasn't really about me anymore. I had simply become the catalyst for a long-brewing conflict within Preston Oaks, a community apparently divided between those who appreciated Stephanie's rigid control and those who had suffered silently under it. The restraining order hearing couldn't come soon enough. Until then, I was living at the epicenter of a suburban civil war I had never intended to start. All because I wanted to plant tomatoes in a yard that wasn't subject to HOA rules. The irony would have been delicious if it hadn't been so exhausting. The certified letter arrived Saturday morning, its heavyweight cream stationery and gold-embossed letterhead clearly designed to intimidate. Preston Oaks Homeowners Association Legal Department proclaimed the top of the page, followed by a Madison Avenue address that seemed suspiciously prestigious for a suburban HOA. "Dear Mr. Bennett," it began with icy formality. "This correspondence serves as formal notice of impending legal action regarding your persistent violations of community standards and interference with HOA governance." The letter outlined a series of increasingly outlandish allegations that I had physically assaulted an HOA officer performing official duties, deliberately misrepresented property boundaries to avoid compliance, and engaged in a coordinated campaign to undermine community standards and property values. Most alarming was the closing paragraph. Failure to remedy all violations and remit payment of $17,450 in accumulated fines within 72 hours will result in the filing of lawsuits for injunctive relief, damages, and legal costs. Additionally, the association will pursue pre-judgment attachment of your property to secure potential judgment amounts. I immediately scanned and forwarded the letter to Maria, who called me within minutes. "This is textbook intimidation," she explained after reviewing the document. "The letterhead alone is suspicious. Let me check if Preston Oaks actually has legal representation at this Madison Avenue address." Her investigation confirmed my suspicions. The prestigious law firm letterhead was completely fabricated. The address belonged to a real firm, but they had no record of representing any homeowners associations, let alone Preston Oaks. "This is getting serious," Maria warned. "Impersonating legal counsel is itself illegal, combined with the false police report, trespassing, assault, and now fraudulent legal threats. We're seeing a pattern of escalating misconduct that goes far beyond typical HOA overreach." We agreed to respond forcefully. Maria drafted a comprehensive cease and desist letter, addressing not just the fraudulent legal threat, but the entire pattern of harassment. The document detailed every incident with supporting evidence: security footage of Stephanie's trespassing and assault, photos of the defamatory flyers, screenshots of the Facebook page, and documentation of the fabricated legal letterhead. "We're not just playing defense anymore," Maria explained as she finalized the letter. "This response put Stephanie and the HOA board on notice that we are preparing countersuits for harassment, defamation, infliction of emotional distress, and potentially fraud if we can establish financial motives behind the boundary manipulation." The cease and desist was delivered Monday morning by process server, a deliberate choice to ensure proper documentation of receipt. By afternoon, the impact was already evident. The Preston Oaks Property Value Protection Facebook page had been hastily deleted, and several of the most aggressive Team Stephanie neighbors were notably absent from their usual surveillance positions. What we didn't anticipate was how quickly Stephanie would pivot to a new strategy. Tuesday morning, I received an urgent call from Jim. They've called an emergency board meeting to approve funding for legal action against Boundary Properties resisting compliance, he reported. Stephanie is pushing for a special assessment, $500 per household, to create a legal defense fund for pursuing cases against you and other non-HOA residents. This was a significant escalation. Rather than continuing her personal vendetta, Stephanie was now attempting to weaponize the entire HOA's financial resources against me. Maria advised me to attend the meeting as an interested party, given that I was the primary target of the proposed legal action. We arrived to find the community center packed with residents, the tension palpable as conversations hushed upon our entrance. Stephanie sat at the center of the board table, a large bandage conspicuously placed on her cheek, where no injury had occurred during our confrontation. Her performance of victimhood was transparent but effective. Several residents glared at me as if I were a violent criminal rather than the actual victim of assault. "This is a closed board meeting," Stephanie announced as Maria and I found seats. "Non-residents are not permitted to attend." "Actually," Maria replied calmly, Under state law governing homeowners associations, any party who is the subject of proposed legal action funded by an HOA has the right to be present when that action is discussed. This legal reality clearly caught Stephanie off guard. She conferred hastily with 2 board members before reluctantly acknowledging our right to remain. The meeting proceeded with Stephanie presenting her version of events, a creative reimagining that portrayed her as the defender of community standards being viciously attacked for simply doing her job. The proposed special assessment would fund a lawsuit seeking to clarify boundary enforcement rights and recover damages for interference with HOA governance. When public comment opened, Maria approached the microphone. "I'm Maria Gonzalez, Mr. Bennett's attorney. Before the board votes on this special assessment, you should be aware of several critical facts." She methodically dismantled Stephanie's narrative, presenting documentation of the property boundaries, evidence of trespassing, and most devastatingly, the security footage of Stephanie's assault and subsequent false police report. Board members should understand, she concluded, that voting to fund litigation based on fraudulent claims could expose you to personal liability. The boundary issue isn't a matter of opinion, it's a matter of legal record that these properties are not within HOA jurisdiction. The room erupted in conflicting reactions, outrage from Stephanie's supporters, murmurs of concern from board members suddenly realizing their potential exposure, and quiet satisfaction from residents who had long endured Stephanie's tactics. Robert, the board member who had witnessed the assault, finally spoke up. "I think we need to table this vote pending legal review. I'm not comfortable proceeding without independent counsel evaluating our position." Stephanie's face flushed with anger. "We don't need outside review. This is a simple matter of enforcing our standards." "It's not simple if we're potentially funding illegal actions," another board member countered. "I move to postpone the vote and seek independent legal opinion." The motion passed despite Stephanie's vehement objections, dealing her first significant setback in the escalating conflict. As the meeting adjourned, Maria handed each board member a copy of our cease and desist letter. "Consider this official notice of potential legal exposure," she informed them. "Any actions taken to further Ms. Wilson's campaign against my client will be viewed as knowing participation in harassment and potential fraud." Walking to our cars afterward, I finally asked the question that had been bothering me for weeks. Why is she so fixated on my property specifically? There are 4 other non-HOA homes along this boundary. Maria's expression turned thoughtful. "That's the question we should be investigating. In my experience, when someone is this determined, there's usually a financial motive beneath the surface." Her observation proved more prescient than either of us realized. The legal escalation had revealed cracks in Stephanie's support system, but it had also hinted at deeper motivations that would soon explain her relentless campaign to control property that wasn't legally within her jurisdiction. The battle was shifting from my front yard to the courtroom, a venue where evidence and legal boundaries mattered more than Stephanie's clipboard and fabricated authority. The courthouse loomed, imposing against the morning sky as I arrived for the restraining order hearing. 2 weeks had passed since Stephanie's assault, and in that time the conflict had evolved from neighborhood dispute to full-blown legal battle. "Ready?" Maria asked, meeting me at the courthouse steps. "As I'll ever be," I replied, adjusting my tie nervously. The restraining order hearing had taken on outsized importance for both sides. For me, it represented the first official legal ruling on Stephanie's campaign of harassment. For Stephanie, it was her opportunity to legitimize her actions and undermine my credibility. We entered courtroom 3B to find it already crowded with familiar faces. The room had essentially divided itself along the same lines as the neighborhood. Stephanie's supporters on the left, sympathetic neighbors, and curious onlookers on the right. Stephanie sat at the respondents' table with a professionally dressed attorney I hadn't seen before. She had maintained the unnecessary bandage on her face, now smaller but still prominently visible. The victim performance extended to her attire, conservative, almost matronly clothing that contrasted sharply with her usual crisp HOA power suits. "Classic courtroom theater," Maria whispered as we took our seats. She's playing to stereotypes, the innocent community volunteer attacked by the aggressive newcomer. Judge Eleanor Harmon entered promptly at 9 a.m. Unlike the audience, she showed no signs of being impressed by courtroom theatrics. Her reputation for no-nonsense efficiency was immediately apparent as she called the case. Petitioner seeks a restraining order against respondent based on allegations of trespassing, harassment, assault, and ongoing intimidation, she summarized, reviewing the file. Let's proceed with opening statements. Maria presented our case. First, methodically outlining the pattern of harassment from my first encounter with Stephanie, through the assault and subsequent community intimidation campaign. She emphasized 3 key points: the clear property boundaries proving Stephanie had no authority over my home, the documented trespassing despite multiple warnings, and the security footage showing Stephanie initiating physical contact. This is not a simple misunderstanding between neighbors, Maria concluded. Ms. Wilson has engaged in an escalating pattern of harassment, trespassing, and intimidation that culminated in physical assault, all because Mr. Bennett insisted on his legal right to be free from HOA oversight on property that is demonstrably outside HOA jurisdiction. Stephanie's attorney, Mr. Patterson, presented a starkly different narrative. In his telling, Stephanie was a dedicated community volunteer being persecuted for doing her job by a homeowner who refused to maintain community standards despite clearly benefiting from proximity to a premier development. Ms. Wilson was simply conducting routine compliance checks when Mr. Bennett became confrontational, he claimed. Any physical contact was incidental and defensive in nature. This petition is merely the latest attempt to undermine legitimate HOA governance. Judge Harmon's expression remained neutral throughout both presentations, though she occasionally made notes in the file. When opening statements concluded, she looked directly at Maria. "Counselor, you've referenced video evidence of the alleged assault. Let's begin with that." The courtroom fell silent as the security footage played on monitors. From multiple angles, it clearly showed Stephanie entering my property uninvited, attempting to push past me, and then delivering the open-handed slap when I blocked her path. The audio captured her threats both before and after the physical contact. When the footage concluded, Judge Harmon turned to Stephanie's attorney. "Counselor, this video appears to directly contradict your characterization of events." Patterson shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, the context preceding this footage is crucial. My client had faced ongoing hostility and obstruction while performing her duties on property outside HOA jurisdiction," the judge interrupted. "The jurisdictional boundaries are precisely what's in dispute," Patterson insisted. Judge Harmon's eyebrow raised slightly. "Are they? Let's address that next. I was called to testify first, presenting my property deed, county records, and the HOA's own incorporation documents, clearly showing the boundaries. Maria guided me through testimony about the escalating harassment, the impact on my daily life, and the community division that had followed. During cross-examination, Patterson attempted to portray me as hostile to community standards and deliberately provocative in my property use. Judge Harmon repeatedly sustained Maria's objections when his questions strayed into irrelevant territory about my personal views on homeowners associations. When Stephanie took the stand, the performance aspect of her testimony became immediately apparent. Her voice quavered as she described feeling threatened during our interactions, and she repeatedly touched the unnecessary bandage while describing the trauma of our confrontation. "Ms. Wilson," Maria began during cross-examination, "can you explain why you continued to enter Mr. Bennett's property after receiving multiple verbal and written notices that you were trespassing?" "As HOA president, I have responsibility for all properties within the community visual corridor," Stephanie replied with practiced confidence. "Is visual corridor a legal term defined in the HOA incorporation documents?" "It's an operational term we use for—" "Please answer the question," Judge Harmon interjected. "Is this term defined in your governing documents?" "Not specifically, but yes or no, Ms. Wilson." Stephanie's composure cracked slightly. "No, Your Honor." Maria continued methodically, establishing that Stephanie had no legal basis for claiming authority over non-HOA properties. had knowingly trespassed repeatedly, and had initiated physical contact during our confrontation. The turning point came when Maria presented evidence of the fabricated legal letterhead and fraudulent violation notices. "Ms. Wilson, did you create these documents purporting to be from a law firm that does not represent your HOA?" Stephanie glanced at her attorney, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. "I was authorized to communicate board decisions using appropriate letterhead." "That doesn't answer my question," Maria pressed. "Did you create these fraudulent legal documents?" "Objection," Patterson interjected. "Characterizing the documents as fraudulent is prejudicial." "I'll rephrase," Maria said smoothly. "Ms. Wilson, did you send documents on letterhead claiming to be from attorneys who do not represent your HOA?" Trapped by the specific question, Stephanie finally admitted the formatting may have been misleading. By the time testimony concluded, the contrast between evidence and Stephanie's narrative was stark. Judge Harmon took only a brief recess before delivering her ruling. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds clear and convincing evidence of harassment, trespassing, assault, and intimidation. The petition for restraining order is granted. She detailed the specific terms. "Stephanie was prohibited from coming within 100 feet of me or my property, contacting me directly or indirectly, or directing others to contact me on HOA matters. Additionally, she was barred from posting or distributing any information about me or my property in any forum. Furthermore," Judge Harmon continued, her tone hardening, "this court is referring evidence of potentially fraudulent legal documents to the district attorney's office for review. Impersonating legal counsel is a serious matter that goes beyond the scope of this hearing. As we left the courtroom, I felt a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. The legal system had finally acknowledged what I had known for weeks. Stephanie's campaign against me wasn't about community standards or property values. It was harassment, pure and simple. "This is just the beginning," Maria warned as we walked to the parking lot. "The restraining order is important protection, but there are still questions about why she's so fixated on your property specifically." She was right. We had won this battle, but the war was far from over. And the true motivation behind Stephanie's obsession with my property was about to become clear in ways none of us anticipated. The restraining order provided immediate relief from Stephanie's direct harassment, but raised deeper questions about her motivation. What had begun as my personal defense against an overzealous HOA president was evolving into something more significant. This level of fixation suggests there's more at stake than just aesthetic preferences, Maria observed during our post-hearing strategy session. "Nobody risks criminal charges and legal exposure over garden vegetables unless there's a compelling financial or personal interest involved. We began investigating with a simple property record search, expecting to find standard HOA documentation. What we discovered instead opened a Pandora's box of questionable practices, extending far beyond my boundary dispute. The first red flag appeared in Preston Oaks's financial disclosures. As a registered HOA, they were required to file annual reports with the county. These showed a pattern of rapidly increasing enforcement revenue over the 5 years since Stephanie became president, from approximately $15,000 annually to nearly $160,000 last year. "That's more than a tenfold increase," I noted, scanning the figures. "Are violations really that common?" "Not naturally occurring ones," Maria replied dryly. "This suggests manufactured infractions as a revenue source." Deeper digging revealed that Valley View Property Management, Stephanie's company, received 40% of all collected fines as an enforcement administration fee. Her financial motivation for aggressive enforcement suddenly became crystal clear, but this still didn't explain her obsession with properties outside HOA boundaries. The answer emerged when we examined Preston Oaks's development plans filed with the County Planning Office. "Look at this," Maria said, pointing to a document titled Phase 3 Expansion. They filed permits 3 years ago for a significant development, addition that would incorporate all the boundary properties, including yours. The plans showed luxury townhomes replacing the existing single-family homes along my side of the street, a development that would significantly increase HOA revenue through additional membership fees and create substantial management fees for Stephanie's company. There's just one problem, Maria continued. The expansion required all boundary property owners to sell. According to these notes, they secured agreements from 3 owners, but 2 holdouts prevented the project from proceeding. My property was one of those holdouts, not because of any decision I'd made, but because the previous owner had refused to sell despite significant pressure. So Stephanie's harassment campaign wasn't just about control, I realized. It was about forcing property sales to complete her development project. Our investigation took on new urgency. We expanded our search to county courthouse records, reviewing property transactions throughout Preston Oaks and surrounding areas. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Properties that had experienced documented HOA harassment typically sold 15–20% below market value, often to shell companies that traced back to board members or their relatives. This goes beyond HOA overreach into potential fraud and conspiracy, Maria observed grimly. They've been systematically targeting properties, creating untenable living conditions through harassment, then acquiring the devalued properties through obscured transactions. The restraining order hearing had cracked Stephanie's facade of authority, and now neighbors began coming forward with their own stories. A retired couple who had sold their boundary property 2 years earlier described a harassment campaign identical to what I'd experienced. Escalating violations, trespassing, and eventually false police reports that made their lives unbearable. We took a $65,000 loss just to escape, the husband explained. Never knew it was part of a larger scheme. We compiled these testimonies alongside our growing documentation, building a comprehensive picture of what appeared to be a years-long conspiracy to manipulate property values and force strategic acquisitions. Jim provided another crucial piece of information. The HOA board was finally reviewing Stephanie's actions following her courtroom defeat. Robert called an emergency executive session, he reported. Apparently, board members are concerned about personal liability after Judge Harmon mentioned potential fraud referrals to the DA. This internal pressure created the perfect opportunity to approach authorities with our findings. Maria arranged a meeting with the county prosecutor's office, presenting our evidence of what appeared to be systematic fraud, property manipulation, and abuse of HOA authority. Assistant District Attorney Patel reviewed our materials with increasing interest. This goes well beyond a neighborhood dispute, she acknowledged. The pattern of harassment followed by below-market sales to connected parties suggests potential conspiracy and fraud. The fabricated legal documents alone constitute multiple criminal violations. By week's end, what had begun as my personal defense had expanded into a full county investigation. Financial crimes investigators were reviewing HOA records, property, transactions and banking activities connected to Stephanie, board members, and their affiliated companies. The community reaction was immediate and dramatic. Board members not implicated in the scheme quickly distanced themselves from Stephanie, with several resigning their positions citing personal reasons. Residents who had supported her began questioning their allegiance as rumors of financial impropriety spread throughout Preston Oaks. Stephanie herself maintained public silence due to the restraining order, but her attorney issued a statement characterizing the investigation as baseless persecution of dedicated community volunteers and retaliation by property owners seeking to avoid legitimate standards compliance. This narrative found little traction as more details emerged about the development scheme and pattern of harassment. Local news coverage shifted from neighborhood HOA dispute to criminal investigation of alleged property fraud scheme, complete with graphics showing the connections between harassed properties and subsequent below-market sales. For me, the expanding investigation brought vindication, but also a strange sense of responsibility. What had begun as my personal defense against harassment had exposed a system that had victimized many families before me. "You should be proud," Maria told me during a case update meeting. "Standing your ground didn't just protect your property. It might bring justice for dozens of families who were forced out of their homes." The investigation's expansion transformed the power dynamics in our neighborhood. Residents who had feared Stephanie's authority now spoke freely about their experiences. People who had been isolated by her divide-and-conquer tactics found community in shared stories of survival. As county investigators continued gathering evidence, I received an unexpected call from Robert, now the acting HOA president following multiple board resignations. "And we need to talk," he said, his voice tense with urgency. "There's something you should know about what Stephanie was really planning for your property, something that explains why she targeted you so aggressively." His revelation would prove to be the final piece of the puzzle and the catalyst for Stephanie's last, desperate act of retaliation against the neighbor who had brought down her carefully constructed empire of control and intimidation. 6 months after the courtroom showdown, I stood in my backyard, admiring my thriving vegetable garden, the simple catalyst that had unexpectedly exposed a years-long fraud scheme and transformed an entire community. My tomato plants climbed sturdy trellises, heavy with ripening fruit that would have violated Stephanie Wilson's aesthetic sensibilities, but now symbolized something far more significant: the victory of property rights over unjust authority. The county's investigation had revealed a scheme more extensive than anyone initially suspected. Stephanie, along with 3 board members and her property management company, had systematically targeted homes both within and outside HOA boundaries, creating hostile living conditions through harassment and fraudulent violations, then acquiring properties at deflated prices through shell companies. The financial paper trail was damning. Over 5 years, the group had acquired 11 properties using these tactics, reselling them for a combined profit exceeding $1.2 million. The development plan for boundary properties would have netted them an estimated $3.5 million more had their scheme not been interrupted by my refusal to be intimidated. Robert's revelation had provided the final piece of the puzzle. My property was particularly valuable because it controlled access to the planned expansion area. The previous owner had rejected multiple offers, becoming the primary obstacle to the development project. When I purchased the house, Stephanie immediately targeted me, assuming a new owner would be easier to pressure into selling. "She never expected you to fight back so effectively," Robert had explained. "Most people either comply or leave. Nobody had ever documented her behavior so thoroughly or pursued legal remedies to completion." The criminal case had proceeded with surprising speed once the financial evidence was assembled. Facing multiple felony charges including fraud, conspiracy, falsifying legal documents, and misappropriation of HOA funds, Stephanie and her co-conspirators had accepted a plea agreement rather than risk trial. The terms were substantial. Stephanie received 3 years probation, significant financial penalties, and permanent prohibition from serving in any HOA leadership capacity or property management role. The court also mandated full restitution to homeowners who had sold under duress, with a fund established to compensate those who had paid fraudulent fines and fees. Beyond the criminal consequences, the civil impact transformed Preston Oaks itself. With the corrupt leadership removed, residents elected a reform-minded board focused on transparency and proper governance. They revised the HOA bylaws to include strict conflict of interest provisions, term limits for board positions, and independent oversight of enforcement actions. Most significantly for me and other boundary residents, the new board formally acknowledged the correct property lines through a legally binding resolution, explicitly stating that Preston Oaks had no authority over properties outside its legal boundaries. The harassment that had defined my first months in my new home was officially and permanently ended. The community healing extended beyond formal acknowledgements. The artificial divisions Stephanie had created between HOA and non-HOA neighbors gradually dissolved as people recognized how her tactics had manipulated them against each other. The us versus them mentality that had dominated local interactions gave way to a more cooperative spirit. This transformation was physically manifested in a community project that would have been unthinkable months earlier: a shared garden space, established on the green area between Preston Oaks and the boundary properties. What had once been a contested visual corridor became a collaborative space where neighbors from both sides grew vegetables, flowers, and relationships untainted by power struggles. Jim captured the changed atmosphere perfectly during the garden's dedication ceremony. Turns out what makes a neighborhood valuable isn't uniform mailbox heights or approved plant lists. It's neighbors who respect each other's rights while finding common ground to build something positive together. Not every wound healed completely. Some of Stephanie's most dedicated supporters remained convinced she had been unfairly persecuted for maintaining standards. A few families even sold their homes rather than adapt to the more balanced community governance that replaced her authoritarian regime. But these departures made room for newcomers who contributed fresh energy to the neighborhood. The Ramirez family, who had been driven away by Stephanie's harassment a year earlier, even repurchased their former home, returning to a community now free from the tyranny that had forced their departure. My own life gradually returned to the quiet existence I had originally sought. The security cameras remained but rarely captured anything more threatening than neighborhood cats exploring my garden. The legal documents that had consumed my dining room table for months were finally archived, the case officially closed with Stephanie's sentencing. The final chapter in the saga came unexpectedly on a warm autumn evening. I was harvesting late, tomatoes when a car pulled up at the curb, a young couple hesitantly approaching my front yard. "Excuse me," the woman called. "We're looking at a house for sale in Preston Oaks and heard about some issues with the HOA here. Would you mind telling us about your experience?" I smiled, gesturing to my flourishing garden that had once been the flashpoint for so much conflict. "It's a great neighborhood now," I said honestly, "but it's a long story that starts with these tomato plants and ends with an important lesson about standing up to bullies." As I shared a condensed version of recent events, their expressions shifted from concern to fascination. "So the HOA boundaries are properly respected now?" the husband asked, clearly weighing whether Preston Oaks would be right for their family. "Absolutely," I assured them. "The new board understands both their authority and its limits. They maintain reasonable standards without crossing legal or ethical lines." After they left to continue their house hunting, I reflected on the extraordinary journey from that first confrontation to the peaceful resolution that now defined our community. What Stephanie had never understood was that true neighborhood value came not from enforced conformity, but from balanced respect for both community standards and individual rights. My tomato garden, once deemed an egregious violation worthy of harassment, trespassing, and ultimately assault, now represented something far more important than vegetables. It stood as a living reminder that sometimes the most important boundaries to maintain are not those between properties, but those between authority and overreach, between community standards and individual freedoms. And those boundaries, like my garden, would continue to flourish under careful tending and principled protection.